Welcome to Book Passage. As always, we thank you for supporting independent bookstores like this one. While I'm doing some housekeeping stuff, if you can check your cell phones, make sure they're on silent or turned off. Everyone around you will appreciate that. And while you're checking those, if you haven't had a chance to pick up a copy of Richard's book tonight, his latest book, and we also have some of his backlist as well. They're all at the registers behind you, and in about an hour after some presentation and some Q&A, you'll have a chance to pick up a copy or two, and once you pay for them, bring them on back, and he'll be signing at the table next to me. If a lot of you in this crowd are like me, the Spanish Civil War is some stuff out of a history book from school, For Whom the Bell Tolls, the Hemingway, and Guernica, and maybe not a lot of knowledge beyond that. It's one of those things where, the Spanish Civil War and Franco, and we may not know more than that. Tonight you're gonna find out a lot more, including some stories that I'm sure you would never have heard otherwise. I was reading the Louis Buñuel portion of this, the great director who tells a story perhaps that Richard will get into that sounds like something from a Buñuel film, but apparently is absolutely true. So hopefully Richard might get into that with you tonight, but a lot more about this horrible war than probably most of us here knew prior to tonight. One quick review from the Wall Street Journal says, in part, Hell in Good Company is characteristically pacey, vivid, and emotive. It reliably conveys the conflict's broad outlines for those who know nothing about the bloody 1936 to 1939 war between the leftist Republican government and the insurgent nationalist forces of Francisco Franco, while adding enough well-sourced fresh material to interest those more familiar with its horrors. Mr. Rhodes succeeds in reanimating familiar scenarios. His solidly researched account of the initially hesitant, even reluctant gestation of Picasso's Guernica in particular makes for thrilling reading. Our guest is Richard Rhodes. He has published 24 previous works, history, 4 novels, also some letters. He is the author of, among others, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, which won the Pulitzer Prize, Dark Sun, The Making of the Hydrogen Bomb, and also a personal memoir, A Hole in the World. Would you please give a nice warm welcome for Richard Rhodes.
Thank you. Lovely. Thank you. A lot more people than I expected. It's wonderful. Such a little war and such a long time ago. and yet it's really held everyone's imagination. When I started out working on it, and I chose the topic because I was thinking about the early beginnings of the mass bombing of cities. And of course, the paradigmatic example of that is the bombing of Guernica in 1937, April. The year I was born, as it turns out, so I was kind of narcissistically drawn to that year as well. But I realized I really didn't know much about this war and started looking into it. And there must be 500 books on the Spanish Civil War. And in the course of research, I bought most of them. I didn't read most of them, I have to admit that, because most of them were about the politics. Most of them were about the really ornate, labyrinthine Spanish politics. And as I say in the beginning of the book, it seemed to me that is kind of ancient history at this point. Spain is now a democracy. Franco's era is over, thank God. Although there's still a lot of conflict we found between those who are on one side and those who are on the other. But I was intrigued more and more by the parts of the story that had not been told. And it turns out, as it always does when you're looking into history, that there was much that was lost. Just to give you one example, I went to the Tamiment Library at New York University, which is a large collection of materials related to the labor movement around the world, and found there memoirs, letters, all sorts of documents that almost literally had never seen the light of day. Most remarkably, I think, was a book-length, completed book manuscript memoir by a New York surgeon named Edward Barsky, who is one of the central characters in my book. Barsky, when he came home from patching people up in Spain, from developing some new medical technologies in Spain, which I'll mention, and from really just barely surviving himself because he had Crohn's disease and was constantly just barely able to function, but he managed to function. By the end of the war, Barsky was in charge of all 24 hospitals that were set up to deal with the international volunteers who had come to Spain to help the Spanish Republic and its people fight the insurgent fascist movement under Franco and his fellow generals. Barsky got home and immediately found a journalist who would help him write his book, and wrote this beautiful 400-page book. The pages typed on good paper were so brown that we couldn't scan them. We had to photograph them, and then I had to have someone type out the parts that I needed to put into my computer program because they hadn't seen the light of day. I asked myself why not in Barsky's case and in the case of these other materials. And I think there are probably two reasons. Certainly for Barsky there were two reasons. One, 4 months after this war was over, it ended in April of '39, of course, with the defeat of the good guys, if you will, with the defeat of the Republic. The Second World War began in Europe. Hitler's people invaded Poland, and off it went. So in a way, this, what Time magazine called a little world war, the one in Spain, was simply swamped by the much larger real world war that followed immediately after. And in Barsky's case, something else as well, because when the Second World War ended, Barsky, like many of the Americans and others who volunteered to fight with the Spanish Republic, were members of the Communist Party. As so many intellectuals and people, I think, of good heart were in the Depression, until mostly they discovered what a beast Stalin was, and those who were smart enough to understand what was going on withdrew. And I don't recall, Barsky continued to be a member of the Communist Party. But after the war, with the invention of the House Un-American Activities Committee, Barsky was called up to testify and refused to give up the names of the people he worked with. And so this eminent New York surgeon was thrown into federal prison for 6 months, had his license withdrawn by the state board for 6 months. And when he got out, the possibility of his publishing a book was obviously zero. So that and so many other amazing stories and documents were just kind of lost in the archives. So it, far from being a tale that's already been told, this turned out to be a story that was full of human stories that really had never seen the light of day. Let me jump back and just spend a couple minutes going through the war for those of you who know as little about it as I knew when I started this venture. Franco and his generals had returned to Spain, not Franco, but most of the generals who were part of the Spanish military, had returned to Spain at the turn of the 20th century when the United States fought Spain in the Spanish-American War, and in this case in particular, liberated Cuba, where many of these generals were living a good life. So suddenly Spain was flooded with generals, and a diplomat talking about Spain once said that the dream of every general in Spain is to stage a coup and become the great hero of the Spanish people. So Franco and his fellow generals were not different in that regard. They also had the experience in North Africa of having fought a true colonial war against the Berbers of North Africa. A true colonial war in the sense of wanton slaughter, bombing from the air, and even in the early 1920s, something that only came out many years later, the use of poison gas. So Franco, who was the youngest man to be made a general in the Spanish military in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, was kind of exiled and made his way to North Africa when he and his colleagues decided that there was a communist takeover coming in Spain. understand the Spanish government was a coalition government at that time. This republic had political parties ranging from anarchists on the left or the right, wherever you put anarchists. When I was in college, we were taught that it's kind of a big circle, and the anarchists meet the fascists somewhere around the ends. In any case, from anarchy through communism to middle-class parties to working-class parties, and so forth. It really, truly was a provisional, it was a coalition government, not simply a communist government. But from Franco's point of view, these were barbaric communists who deserved to be treated in war no better than the Berbers had been in North Africa. Now the irony is, most of Franco's army at the outset of the war were Berber mercenaries whom he hired on. And he had the problem immediately of how to get them across the Mediterranean to Spain when the Republic had managed to at least keep the loyalty of the Spanish Navy, unlike the army officers who all defected to Franco, leaving the army essentially decapitated, so that in the early months of the war, most of the fighting was on the part of the Republic was conducted by militias put together by labor parties and any other groups that could gather a group together and get out there and fight for their country to save it from this invasion. Franco sent forces to talk first to Mussolini, who was skeptical about who was really in charge, because there were several generals representing different parts of the insurgents. So he sent another delegation to see Hitler. Hitler had just come from one of Wagner's operas. He was in whatever the name of that town is, where they have the festival every summer of Wagner. And he at first was skeptical, but as he warmed to the subject, and I think as the Wagnerian music flowed through his brain, he started seeing this as a great enterprise that would work for him too. So he volunteered the use of his what is the word I want? He volunteered the use of his Air Force, which was disguised as Lufthansa at that point, because part of the peace treaty with Germany at the end of the First World War was that Germany wouldn't have an Air Force. So they simply invented Lufthansa, and the pilots in Lufthansa were Air Force pilots under Hermann Goering. He loaned Franco some passenger planes. They were planes that were dual purpose. They could easily be switched over to be used as bombers, and they were very shortly after this. And thus was conducted the first large-scale airlift in the history of war, flying these Berber mercenaries over from North Africa to Spain to start what was a bloody march right up Spain toward Madrid and farther along toward Barcelona. The American volunteers, who very quickly came together in the United States, raised money, hired a passenger ship, and found their way to Spain to help fight. Many of them members of the Communist Party, some of them unemployed in the Depression, lots of longshoremen from the docks in New York and even as far as west of San Francisco. They all converged in New York, and they found their way over just in time to save Madrid from Franco's invasion. There's a photograph in the book showing 3,000 of these men with their arms raised in the Spanish Republic's masterful salute, marching through the streets. So Franco was stuck for a while. He couldn't take over Madrid. He really couldn't move at all at that point. So he moved his forces to the north and started working on the Basques in the northern part of Spain along the Bay of Biscay. And that's what led to eventually the bombing of Guernica and the taking over of the whole northern part of Spain. If you follow through the months of the war, it was this process by Franco of fighting mostly a ground war. He had now a good-sized air force that Hitler had loaned him, the so-called Condor Legion, about 5,000 men, counting pilots and mechanics and so forth, and a nice little fleet of bombers and fighters. So his idea was to fight a ground war, hold the ground he took, which he did basically by massacring all the military-age males in whatever towns he went through, and take over the northern part of Spain. He had the southwestern part of Spain, that was Gibraltar, where he'd come ashore, and then slowly moved down basically along the Ebro River and cut the country in half, which he managed to do by April of 1938. At that point, what was left was kind of a rough republic focused in Catalonia with its new capital in Barcelona, and they fought on until finally they lost. Barcelona was never actually crushed by Franco's military, but it reached a point where there was nothing left, no food, no armaments, and they simply at that point surrendered. So the whole thing was over by April of '39, just in time for the Second World War. The following September, George Orwell wrote later, one of the bitter things we learned in the Spanish Civil War was that the good guys don't always win. And they didn't, of course. Franco ruled the country for the next, well, till he died in 1975, for the rest of his life. So that's the fundamental story. I left a lot out, but I just wanted to frame it. What I turned to and looked at were these extraordinary people who found their way into the war, and particularly the volunteers who came from France and Germany, Great Britain, and the United States. A total in the course of the war of about 40,000, mostly men, some women, of whom at least 6,000 were killed in the course of the war, which makes for some really powerful stories of love affairs in war. Barsky was a character who interested me because he had the task, as physicians often do in war, of making do with whatever he had at hand. And in particular, trying to, there was a blockade around Spain by the good democracies, Great Britain and France and others, who felt somehow that if they could only hold the Germans down and placate the fascists, that maybe they could prevent a Second World War. And of course, the people who volunteered in Spain thought just the opposite. They volunteered because they thought if they could defeat fascism in Spain, they might forestall a Second World War. And of course, they didn't make that happen, and they didn't forestall that war, but that was their expectation and their hope. You have to imagine, these were people like some of us here, well, in our younger days at least, who simply put aside whatever they had in their lives and got on a ship or took a plane, if they were in England, and went to Spain and risked their lives. It's really quite extraordinary. And the question of why they did that really has to do, I think, with a degree of idealism that we might well think naive today. But certainly they didn't think so at the time, and they were willing to put their lives on the line in order to try to make a difference in a little place far away. So Barsky's problem, one of his problems, was that they had, when a battle was fought, far more casualties than they could possibly handle in any short period of time. And he and his fellow physicians from all over Europe, not only from the United States or England, started thinking about how could you sort the casualties. And they decided that there should be perhaps 4 categories. They called this process triage. It had never been used in war before in this way. Normally the way doctors dealt with casualties was to treat the most seriously wounded first, and then the less seriously wounded, and so forth. But in time of war, when the main task, especially if you're outnumbered, is to get the most lightly wounded soldiers back into the lines, then they had to invent some other way to sort. And the method they came up with was to first deal with people whose immediate treatment would save their lives. People who were bleeding heavily, people who had blocked airways, the things that everyone learns in first aid about whom you treat first. But once that was done, then the wounded who were obviously not going to survive, whose wounds were so terrible that they clearly could not be fixed, were simply given some kind of pain relief and put aside. And those who were lightly wounded and could be bandaged and so forth, stitched and put back into battle, were given first priority. Those whose treatment could be delayed were kind of in the middle of this list. So an invention that, like these other inventions I'm going to mention to you, had an enormous effect on medicine ever after, was invented in this little war in this small place, in this very much third world country at the time. 60% of the population of Spain was illiterate in 1931 when the Republic first took power through elections, because the wealthy, the nobility, the king, the various dictators who had ruled in Spain throughout the second half of the 19th century and first quarter of the 20th had basically aligned themselves, the church had aligned itself with them. There were no public schools, there were only church schools, and you had to pay for those. So many, many members of the Spanish population were living in a kind of third world conditions on giant estates that belonged to the wealthy, which they would sometimes just decide they'd rather have for a place to run their horses, and to hell with the people who were starving down the road. There was a reason why the people in Spain were ready, as they did in the early weeks of the war, to kill 6,000 priests and several hundred nuns. They were so angry at the church for having colluded with the people who had been oppressing them for so long that they just felt it was time to clean things up. As soon as the new Spanish Republican government took control of the early months of the war, when there was all this kind of ad hoc and amateur fighting and killing and massacring going on, these extracurricular assassinations were basically ended. Not on Franco's side. Franco's solution, as I said, to holding the rear as he advanced was to make sure that there was no one behind him who was going to cause him any trouble. So they would typically shoot most of the men in the village when they had taken over the village. Or worse, because the Berbers from North Africa were pretty savage tribesmen with lots of reason not to like the Spanish, not to mention the fact that they were Muslim and they didn't particularly like Christians either. So they were prepared to rape and pillage, and they did all that. So Barsky is one example of the kind of person I found as I looked into the old records. One of the more colorful figures was J.B.S. Haldane, whom those of you who are knowledgeable at all about science will recognize was one of the great biologists of the 20th century, very much involved in the whole modern synthesis of the evolutionary model of the evolution of creatures. Haldane, who was a member of the Communist Party in England, volunteered to come to Spain in the late fall of the first year of the war, 1936, because there had been some shells fired by Franco's forces that were painted green and looked as if they might be gas shells. There were different colored shells used in the First World War to indicate what kind of poison gas they contained, or if they were simply explosives and so on. And some of those shells had turned up in the aftermath of a battle, and the Spanish military leaders wanted to know, was Franco using poison gas? If so, they had to get masks out to their soldiers and all. So Haldane came down. He was an expert on poison gases from having worked with his father on gases during the First World War. Haldane came down to check it out, and as soon as he checked it out, he realized that it wasn't, or if it was just one assault, and that there was not really anything very effective about using poison gas shells on a big stone city like Madrid, that you were much better off using high explosives, as he writes considerable disgust. He said, you know, you can kill a lot more people faster with high explosives, tearing down buildings and sending pieces of stone flying everywhere, than trying to get gas in the concentrations it needs in order to kill people. He wrote several books in the course of the war. He would come down during, in between term times at the University of London where he taught and help the Spanish out and then go back and teach his courses. In the meantime, he wrote several books trying to convince the British government, which was a very conservative government at that time, that it would do well to dig deep bomb shelters and not simply rely on using the subway system in London as a place for people if the Second World War occurred, which he was pretty sure it would. They didn't believe him, and they didn't want to spend the money either. And that was one of the tragedies of the Blitz, that there were a lot of people killed who might not have been killed. One of the things you can see in Spain, if you go there, are these extraordinary deep underground bomb shelters. You know, Spain is a land of minerals, and a lot of miners with a lot of skills at tunneling and digging live in Spain today, as they did then. So the miners dug these absolutely wonderful brick-lined tunnels. We visited one that's open to the public as a kind of museum. Was it in Barcelona? Was it in Madrid? Barcelona, yeah. It's just tunnels deep under a hillside in the middle of the city. And people could go there, and in fact, these shelters held something like 350,000, 400,000 people. Really an amazing network all over the city, and correspondingly saved a lot of lives. And, you know, I think one of the messages of this war is what a forlorn hope it was for so many people in so many ways, trying to convince the British government that they could learn something from a war that was going on right now was simply hopeless, evidently. Paulding was understandably disgusted. Two other people, one a Spanish doctor and the other a Canadian doctor, who independently started working on some way. They started noticing that the troops who were wounded in the front lines, who early in the war would be trucked all the way back to the rear hospitals in the cities away from the front lines, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 hours bouncing over the terrible Spanish roads in an open truck or an ambulance. They started noticing that these guys were bleeding out by the time they got back to the hospital. And they realized that, I mean, they were exsanguinating. They'd lost all their blood and died. And separately, one of them in Barcelona and the other in Madrid, and the Canadian, whose name was Norman Bethune, really colorful figure who was constant. So I think he must have been manic depressive, because he was either full of enormous energy or just angry and drinking and drunk and whatever. They finally threw him out of Spain. They didn't know what to do with this man. But he was inventive and energetic. And he started working on a system of collecting blood, treating it with sodium citrate to prevent it from clotting, refrigerating it for up to 2 weeks at a time. This is all familiar to us now, but no one had done this yet. And then he commandeered a fish delivery truck, because it had a refrigeration system in it, and he loaded his bottles. He said, we're sort of milkmen. He loaded his bottles in the truck, and they made regular deliveries to the front line to deliver the blood to the wounded before they made the trip back to the rear hospitals. There's a wonderful photograph, which I did not put in the book, but it shows a table full of bottles of blood ready to be delivered. But they're not what we would think of as a blood container. They're wine bottles and milk bottles, sterilized. It was such a new and pioneering technology. They didn't have a standardized system for storing the blood. So here is this bottle. It looks like it's a fine red wine, but it's somebody's blood ready to go out to save someone's life. So again, this technology of storing blood, never used before this way. The Russians had actually developed stored blood in the 1920s, because the country, Soviet Union, was so big that they couldn't do what everyone else was doing, which was simply having a list of blood donors. And if someone came into the emergency room and needed blood, they would type that person and then they'd call up the donor, and the donor would come in and they'd do it arm to arm. But that didn't work in the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union sprawled across 11 time zones. So they developed stored blood and shipping it out, but it had never been used in war before. This is this kind of gathering of different technologies. And Norman Bethune did all this, and the Spanish doctor did a similar system with rather more sophisticated bottles, actually, in Barcelona, and eventually they discovered each other. They each had a list of about 1,000 women donors in each of their cities who would come in and give a pint of blood once a month. And later in the war, when the blockade was effective and people all over Spain were basically starving, they would reward the women who made the donations by giving them a decent meal in the military canteen, in the military cafeteria. And that was quite enough, and they were happy for that. George Orwell, we know who he is. I don't know if you've ever read his wonderful book, Homage to Catalonia, which is his memoir of his experiences in the war. Just a couple stories about him to tell you, and there are a lot more in the book. When he arrived from England, he really didn't know more about the war than that he wanted to cover it and he wanted to participate. So he walks into Madrid, into the place where some of the political leaders were, and basically says, I want to join up. Who wants me? He didn't even know the different political organizations.
Wow.
And there was an English woman there who was a member of parliament, and she was suspicious. Who is this man? Is he a spy? What's he doing here? So she wasn't prepared to tell him anything. But as she talked to him, she noticed that he had a pair of brand new boots hanging over his shoulder. He was a tall man, Orwell was, and he had big feet. And when she asked him, what are you doing with those boots? He said, well, I knew there'd be a shortage of boots in Spain in my size, and I didn't want to have to go barefoot, so I brought my own boots. And she thought, oh my God, well, this guy's obviously serious. And she pointed him in the right direction to one of the militias. And he spent the whole winter that year on one of the lines that was basically just frozen with another line of Franco's forces down in the valley, this line up on top of a ridge, acquiring lice and all the things you require in the military or did in those days. Finally got a chance to go back to Madrid and have a good hot bath, which he said I wanted more than anything I'd ever wanted in my life. And then, because there was a little mini civil war going on in Barcelona at the time, where he'd gone on to stay, he spent 3 days up on a roof with his fellow militia, guarding it from another militia group across the street on another roof, and reading books that he'd managed to bring with him in the meantime, worrying always that the other guys might get the phone call that would say, shoot those people. So when that was over, he was sent back out, and he was really disgusted by that. Well, as I said, he was the tall man. The trench was only so deep. And one morning, very shortly after he got back to the battle lines, he stood up and took a bullet through the throat. Half an inch from any major structure that would have instantly killed him, caused him to bleed to death. It only kind of bruised his vocal cords, and for about 6 months he couldn't speak very loudly. That was the only thing that happened to him. But he took that as an omen and decided it was time to go home, and very soon went back to England and started writing his book, which was actually not published till the 1950s. So that's Orwell. Picasso, painting his wonderful painting Guernica. Picasso, the year before the Spanish Civil War, this man who could paint a masterpiece in a day, painted not one painting for an entire year. And the scholars say it was because he was going through a stylistic crisis. I don't think so. what he was going through is his first wife was divorcing him, the Russian ballerina, and she told him very early on when she kicked him out that there were community property laws in France, and that she would, of course, immediately do an inventory of all the paintings that were in their common property. And at that point he said, well, to himself, I'm not going to paint any more paintings so that Olga can have half of them. No way. And he kind of hung around the cafes and made sketches and had a good time. Gertrude Stein wrote about him later and said, well, Picasso had this wonderful year where he didn't have any responsibilities. He could just talk and drink wine and enjoy himself in the cafes. And she said, you know, it's kind of like someone in a war, which is interesting for the war itself. She said soldiers, although they risk their lives all the time, actually have no responsibilities. Their job is to take orders. They're not supposed to initiate anything, except, you know, depending on where they are in rank. So, but in any case, finally, when the war began, the new Spanish government asked Picasso if he would become the director of the Prado and help them deal with getting those paintings to safety, which he did very proudly. He was very glad to take on this duty, and with his own considerable wealth at that point, as well as his organizational skills, he managed to help them move the great paintings of the Prado, either deep underground in safe places or actually out of Madrid and into a castle that was very, very thick-walled and solid, and they were preserved throughout the war that way. So by January of 1937, now 6 months into the war, a delegation of Spanish government officials came to Picasso in Paris and asked him if he would do a mural for the Spanish pavilion that was going to open at the French International Exposition that summer in Paris. And he said, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And then he had the task for the next 3 months, having not painted for a year, of trying to think, what the hell am I going to paint? What's the subject? What am I going to do? He painted all sorts of paintings of his various mistresses. He painted some very nice still lives. But he couldn't get the war. He'd never been in a war. Bombing terrified him. He didn't want to be around it, and he never had been. What was he going to do? And then, as he followed the news stories that came out, particularly now with the Condor Legion having moved to the northern part of Spain and beginning the kind of systematic bombing that would eventually back the Basques into their last holdout in, what's the name of the Basque city where the big museum is now?
Bilbao.
Bilbao, yes, right, Bilbao. He was following the story in the newspaper. And when the news of the bombing of Guernica, this town of only 6,000 people, maybe swollen to 10,000 with refugees, but the ancient capital of the Basque people, a place where they had written a constitution in the 13th century, had always been an independent people, had always kind of struggled with the Spanish government about trying to be on their own, but not, and so on. The Condor Legion went over that town with high explosives and then with 2-pound magnesium incendiary bombs, and they lit the whole place up and burned it down in one afternoon. And they killed, it's not clear how many people, but at least 1,000 in one afternoon. Picasso was truly outraged. And at that point he had his subject, and he began painting this huge mural. If you've ever seen it, it's shocking. If you've seen it in books, as we all have, you just aren't prepared to grasp how huge it is. It's the size. If that wall extended all the way over there, it's that big. It's about 25 feet long, 10 or 12 feet high. Black and white, like a newsreel. And everything in it that's human is looking up and screaming, except the one composite figure of the bull. The bull is looking straight out at the viewer with an expression on his face somewhere between shock and disgust. And as several of the art critics who've looked carefully at the painting said, the bull has Picasso's eyes. It's a most extraordinary painting. If you're ever in Madrid, go visit it's now in the Reina Sofia right next door to the Prado. It's in its own room. You walk in, and if you don't burst into tears, you don't have enough humanity in you. It's just remarkable. All of the proceeds from the exhibition, of course, went to the Spanish government. Picasso, in the end, donated several $100,000 in modern dollars to the cause, and then paid for people who escaped at the end of the war. So let me quickly move forward. There are many other stories like this. Miro painted a mural almost as large as Picasso's for the same exhibition. I have a photograph in the book showing him on a scaffolding painting his mural. It's a Miro peasant, but unlike most of the peasants he drew, it also the figure is just full of rage. He has a sickle in his hand. He's obviously prepared to fight with that sickle. And that, which was painted on 6 panels of a kind of a masonite composite material and was dismantled after the exhibition closed, put on trucks to be taken to safety, disappeared. No one has seen it since. The photograph I have in the book is one of a small group of photographs taken when Miro was painting the painting, and that's the only trace that's left of this magnificent piece of work. That's another aspect of war, of course. So let me jump forward to, there are lots of other stories and lots of other characters, but I leave them for you to read. Let me jump forward to one of my favorite people who was basically unknown outside of the small group of people who have followed the Spanish War in the books that have been written since then. An English woman named Angela Jackson, who now lives in Spain, very close to where these events occurred, got very interested in a British nurse named Patience Darton, who came to Spain in the spring of '37 wanting to help, and was immediately put to work helping heal one of the battalion leaders in the International Brigade, which was the group of people from other countries fighting with the Republic, who had typhoid and who was getting the kind of terrible care that was available in Spanish hospitals in those days. I don't know why the Spanish were so backward in their medicine, but unfortunately they were. And in addition, since all the nurses in the Spanish hospitals were nuns, when the patients were brought in, perhaps teeming with lice and dirty uniforms and blood and so forth, the nuns wouldn't bathe them. They would just put them on a dirty bed and feed them and take care of those needs, but they couldn't undress a male. So here were these awful conditions. Spanish doctors believed that typhoid patients should be fed as little food as possible. They somehow thought that the food would cause a reaction intestinally with the typhoid bacillus and kill them. So she encounters this poor, dirty captain who is wearing the same clothes they brought him in on. Well, you have to imagine this tall, big blue-eyed, really beautiful Spanish or English nurse who, as she says, well, we're, nurses, they're bossy. She came in and she swept the place out and she cleaned the guy up and she started getting food for him, and pretty soon he was on his feet. And then she had the problem for the next 6 months, as the whole crowd of English nurses who had come to Spain, several dozen of them had, of trying to convince the Spanish leadership to let them go help in the front lines and not just stick them off in a hospital somewhere dealing with tuberculosis cases or whatever. There was one time when patients got so impatient with the hospital they put her in, which was a classic Spanish dirty hospital, that she got all the medical students together and a lot of the Spanish chicas, who were the young women who were usually illiterate, but who were used by the nuns to sweep the floors and carry out the feces and so forth, but who really wanted to learn to help the patients. She got them all together and pointed out to them that a generation of throwing all the hospital waste out the back window into the backyard of the hospital, including all the shit, had produced a monumental pile that was so covered with flies that if you just flipped the window, this cloud would go up all over it. She said, "We're going to clean that up," and they did. And they cleaned up the whole hospital, and when they left, it was a well-organized hospital unit. Anyway, eventually patients, by the subterfuge of slapping the Spanish cook and being kicked out of the hospital where she was working, managed to find her way to a forward hospital. And she worked there, and she eventually also worked in the front lines. In the forward hospital, she met a German carpenter who had been, actually he was a German Jew whose family had gone to Palestine in the 1930s to start the Zionist movement and to open up that land. He was now back in Europe fighting as an anti-Nazi and had joined the war for that reason, to fight fascism. They fell in love. He moved with her to the hospitals where she was moved until he was healed, and then they got together whenever he had leave. She told the most loving and beautiful stories about when it was spring and they were together and they went into the little village and he was hungry, so they sat down and had some eggs cooked in olive oil. And she said, I would say it was all spiritual and angelic, but he had 16 eggs, and no angel could ever eat 16 eggs, she said. Well, eventually, late in the war, in the summer of 1938, when most of Spain was gone and it was basically Catalonia that was left, the international brigaders decided with their Spanish generals to make a kind of a last stand on the Ebro River and try to push back Franco's forces that were advancing toward the river, being basically the western boundary of Catalonia. They hoped that by a surprise crossing of the river in the early morning of July 4th or 5th, 1938, they could surprise the Spanish forces and really push them back. This despite the fact that now both Hitler and Mussolini were supplying all the military armaments, the planes, the artillery, everything else that Franco could possibly need, while on the Republic side they were less and less well armed as the supplies ran out, and the Soviet Union had long since given up on the whole thing and stopped supplying them, even though they were paying Stalin in Spanish gold for everything that he sold them. So in the early morning hours, her now husband, Patience's husband, and several thousand other men, walking across a little pontoon bridge before they were discovered by Franco's side, made it across the river, set up some perimeters, started fighting their way, made it 50 or 75 kilometers in before the pushback came with all of the artillery and all of the planes. There were lots of wounded and lots of seriously wounded, particularly from shrapnel. And I want to just read to you. Oh, let me add one more detail before I read this section. They needed a place close to the river where they could deal with the most seriously wounded as quickly as possible. They located a wonderful cave. I would call it a shelter rather than a cave, about halfway up a mountain with a very narrow valley in front of it. There was this Neolithic shelter, huge mass of stone over it, a nice, relatively flat floor, and then it sloped back about 40 feet into the mountainside. And in the back, almost miraculously, was a spring of clear, cold water coming out of the mountain. In fact, the cave was called the Cave of Santa Lucia, and it was celebrated for being a place where the waters would heal afflictions of the eye. So it was really, in its own paradoxical way, a rather magical place. In this cave, as a kind of hospital, they set up 120 beds and a complete surgical suite on the little floor of the little canyon right on in front. And the beauty of the setting was the German fighter planes couldn't dive into this narrow canyon and then strafe into the cave. And they couldn't bomb it from above because of this huge thickness of solid stone over it. So it was a safe place. And here were brought the seriously wounded from the Battle of the Ebro, the last really major battle of the war. And so I just want to read to you now the description of this time in the war and what patients had to say about it. This is patients writing. The cave was very uncomfortable. It was very dark, very low, and all uneven. The metal beds were all higgledy-piggledy over the floor, and you could barely see. We hadn't got lights. We had lights for the surgical theater run off of one of our ambulances, but we hadn't got lights in the cave ward. And we had to do our work by little tiny oil lamps, ordinary tin sardine cans with wicks in them with oil. It isn't much light, a miserable little fickle light, and you couldn't see across the cave, and you kept banging yourself on those iron beds. Worse than that was patients. Worse than the lighting problem and the banged shins, far worse was the condition of the wounded hauled up from the river, sorted at the triage station on the valley floor, and then hand carried around on the access ramp into the cave. Patients again. We had an awful lot against us. They had a lot more artillery on their side than we had, and we were obviously very near to a lot of good mortars, because we had a lot of mortar wounds, and they're much bigger, they're much more smashed up things. And mortars take great chunks out of people if they survive at all. Huge lumps had been hurled out of them, much more smashing up stuff than bullets which go through you. We tended to get people at night because the shelling was so enormous they couldn't move in the day. So for the first time we got people rather long after battle. We got them sometimes hours after they'd been wounded, and some of course we couldn't save because of that. They were already too bad. The road that passed above the cave hospital led to the battlefront. From the cave vestibule day and night, Darton watched truckloads of the last Republican draft. Children, she remembers, 15 and 16-year-olds in the last call-up, going up to the front. It was more than she could bear, she thought, although there is always more to bear in war, particularly when your side is losing patients. And we saw what happened when they got to the front, these terrible smashed up people streaming in. And to hear those kids singing as they went up, it was terrible when I thought what was going to happen to them, and it got me down frightfully. We were working terribly hard. It was very uncomfortable, very dark in that cave, and almost everyone who came in was pulseless and seriously ill. I was on nights, and this darkness and the discomfort and the seriousness of it, I thought it wasn't worth it. I thought no war is worth all this misery and this horror. Perhaps no war is, not even that first desperate war against fascism to which the Spanish people were abandoned by the democracies and by the Soviet Union as well, so that of Spain's 24 million souls, fully 500,000 died directly or from hunger and disease, or immediately afterward in Franco's 100,000 vindictive executions. The more that Patience Darton could bear at least came on quickly at the end of the first week of the Battle of the Ebro. The tall young British nurse, Robert A Quist's cherished pancake. Her husband, Robert, called her pancake when she'd lost a lot of weight. She was quite tall and she got very thin, so that was his tender name for her. The tall young British nurse received a letter dated 31 July 1938 from Sergeant Bert Rahman, 41st Battalion Machine Gun Company, addressed, "Esteemed comrade, I ask you above all to accept these lines calmly," the letter began, and continued on 27 July 1938. Robert was killed, struck a mine, and died immediately. A few days before, he charged me with notifying you in the event of his death. At the same time, I am sending all his letters to you, yours to him, as well as his parents, and ask you to notify them of his death. Sergeant Rahman went on to praise his comrade. We know what we have lost in him. In the next days, Fritz Jensen, the Viennese physician, hearing of patients' grief and exercising war's curious compassion, arranged her transfer to the battlefront. The move to the front was like a sort of therapy, she would say appreciatively. Before she left the cave hospital, however, Santa Lucia, the waters of which are said to heal afflictions of the eyes, Darton wrote Robert A Quist's parents in Palestine with news of his death. She wrote of her love for him and of his for her. She told them he had loved them and had cherished the photographs they had sent. She assured them these last 8 months were full of joy for him. Patience Darton, one among 40,000 international volunteers, changed her mind then about the worth of war, of that war at least, war as one man had fought it, as she was fighting it. For me and for many, she wrote of her husband, interred now in a common grave among his comrades. He was a revelation of how to live and fight against the thing that is trying to ruin the world.
We have time for just a few questions.
Yes, of course.
Anybody?
Yes, Richard, thanks so much. Before I ask you my question about the challenge of writing this colossal book on your studies of the Spanish Civil War, having read the book, I want to commend you for writing a book that makes the subject timeless, up-to-date, and readily available for new audiences as well as people who know it and will be surprised with the new information you have provided. I think that's a great achievement, and you evoke both the psychotic, mentality of fascism as well as the courage of the people defending their principles of freedom. So my question to you is that twofold in a way. How long, from start to finish, did it take once you decided to undertake the challenge to do the research, to write it, to do this, and in the process, this personal part, were you surprised to find the degree of complexity as well as ferocity on both sides that is involved in every aspect? And also, how did you cope with this, basically? Since it is a challenge of fortitude for any writer, I can say from my own experience, to deal with this.
Yeah, I spent 2 years on this book. It's really, believe it or not, in this day and age of small advances, that's all I can afford anymore. 2 years on a book. But as it turns out, publishers really aren't terribly interested in long books, unless they're really long books. When I proposed this book, my agent looked at the proposal, which among other things said, I expect to write a book of about 100,000 words, which is about 350 pages. And she said, look, write it any length you want, but why don't you just say 75,000 words? I mean, that's where we are today with the writing of books. Unless you're independently wealthy or immensely successful, and I'm really a mid-list author, my books typically sell around 60,000 copies in hardcover and paperback in the first couple of years. So I kind of know where I fit in and how much time I can spend on a given subject. But that said, I think that was about the right scale for these stories, because I never intended to recapitulate Hugh Thomas's huge and magnificent volumes on the whole war. But on the other hand, Hugh Thomas, in his big book on the Spanish Wars, spends literally exactly one paragraph on the medical aspects of the war. So clearly there was room to open that up and to deal with that, and as well the people. But I really set out at the outset thinking, anyone who wants to know about the politics of the war can go read one of those 500 books. I want to get at something that's been rather invisible, as I said, literally invisible, buried in the archives, and drew on it that way. In terms of how you deal with the feelings of the war, you know, after you've written about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after you've written a book about the bullet holocaust, as I did, my book Masters of Death, that was the most terrible thing I've ever had to write, because my wife and I visited all of those killing sites from Lithuania all the way down to Babi Yar in Kyiv, and then read all the accounts of the very few survivors and so forth. I mean, I had literally had nightmares for months when I wrote that book. I wrote it because no one had told that part of the story, and I thought the people who were killed deserved to have their story told. So in a way, this was a bit of a cakewalk, you know. This was just not an ordinary war. Civil wars are always more brutal than regular wars between strangers. There's too much family blood and family feeling. To this day, one of the things that, when we visited Spain, we were introduced to a tall, ruggedly handsome Spaniard whose day job is to make bridges, beautiful teeth. That's his work. He's a craftsman. But he happens to live right on the edge of the Brunetta battlefield outside of Madrid. And some years ago discovered that it was full of the shards of battle, and bought himself one of those magnetometers, one of those metal detectors, and used to go out on weekends and collect broken shell casings and bullets and pieces of old machine guns, and then with just a little trowel started collecting everything else that was there: eyeglasses, teeth, pieces of femur, broken skulls. He had a basement full of these artifacts that he brought together, all of them kind of the same color of gray that the soil, that clay soil, was in that particular piece of prairie in the middle of Spain. And he had tried to give his collection to the local museum, and it was a superb collection. Here was a vision of the war in pieces, all organized in his basement. They wouldn't touch it. They said it's too controversial. So even now, all those years later, people are living down the street from someone who killed their father, and so on. So it's still very much a fraught emotional struggle for the people of Spain, but less so if you're coming from the outside, obviously. So it was, just as history always is, a wonderful sense of discovery and learning. Writing 25 books has been like learning 25 different subjects, and it's been great fun over the years. Someone here, yes, ma'am.
I'm curious, did you say that Guernica was bombarded before Madrid was taken?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that, see?
Oh, yeah. Madrid was never officially taken. I mean, in the sense of an army invaded and beat down the people there. It eventually surrendered when there was no more any hope of doing anything. But Guernica was overrun by the Franco's forces in, I think, May or June of 1937, about halfway through the war. And the whole northern part of Spain.
Very sad. I went to the
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
village.
Yeah.
Oh, just very
Well,
sad.
that beautiful museum.
And then you see
is there
the,
now.
yeah, that's right. And then you see the painting.
Yes.
You just have to cry
Oh,
for
yes,
hours.
yes,
Took me
absolutely.
hours.
When I was a college undergraduate, just learning about modern art, Guernica was in the Museum of Modern Art still. It hadn't gone back to Spain. This was in the late 1950s. I used to get on the train from New Haven and go to New York and just sit in front of that painting. It was kind of my introduction to modern art, and it was so powerful and so overwhelming.
Yes.
So it was amazing to see it back where it belonged.
It
on
is
this trip.
It is a very interesting book. It's very small. My husband has passed away now, but gave me about the making of Guernica.
Yes,
And have you seen that book?
there are
And
several
explains-
books,
And
yeah,
explains all the little
right.
faces and expressions and why he did that. Very interesting book.
Well, my wife, who knew my interest in the painting years ago, gave me a boxed set of facsimiles of all the sketches and tryout drawings that Picasso did before he painted the big painting. So I was able to open those up now, all these years later, and actually walk through exactly where you'll see there's a whole chapter devoted to the painting of this painting.
Yeah.
But it was such a fascinating piece of work. Someone else, sir?
One Shade of Grey, I understand that when Hitler went to good to try to talk Franco and joined the Axis powers after 1941, he said no. Hitler
Yes,
said it was like pulling teeth to
right.
deal with Franco, but Franco said he didn't trust him, that's why.
Well, he also really didn't have that much left in the way of money and forces. Franco sat out the Second World War. I don't know if you were aware of that. I really wasn't until I did this homework. But they'd sat out the First World War also. Spain didn't fight in the First World War and made a lot of money supplying armaments and so forth to the other countries that did, and then went into a depression like the rest of the world after the war. But they didn't fight in the Second World War, and then Franco very cleverly aligned himself with the United States' anti-communist fervor of the 1950s and forward. So we supported this guy for a long time after the war, yes.
I have two questions.
Yes.
First one, when the American men who joined the Labor Brigade came back, how were they treated by the United States?
Badly. There's a wonderful newspaper article that was written by one of them. Actually, I think this man was the British Oxford Don today, and this article was in the New York Review of Books some years ago. He said, the FBI told us that we were premature anti-fascists, and that we were therefore suspect. Now, they were treated as those of you who followed that part of American history, as anyone who was even remotely related to communism or what J. Edgar Hoover thought of as the pinko left were treated, as Robert Oppenheimer was treated after he gave the United States the atomic bomb and all that came with it. As one of his fellow scientists said at his hearing, "What do you want, mermaids?" And yet Oppenheimer had his security clearance lifted and was basically ruined because he had flirted with the Communist Party in the 30s when he was spending his own wealth, and he was a wealthy man, to bring Jews out of Nazi Germany before the Holocaust fell on them. So it was not a happy time in American life for those people.
And could you talk a little bit about the role of the church in that it was the Soviet government that was the only government that was supporting the
Supporting the
monarchy,
Republic, yeah.
the republic?
Stalin was, and I think it was pretty cynical on his part, but he certainly was supplying armaments and aircraft, not troops, specialist people who could run the equipment that he was supplying. But he was insisting on cash on the barrelhead all through that time. And the Spanish government had all that American gold, all that Mayan gold that they had assembled over the centuries. And I think Stalin in the end got about the equivalent of about $335 million worth of it to pay for all the equipment that he sold Spain. But when he no longer saw it serving his purposes, he pulled out immediately. The last Soviet diplomat left Spain, as I recall, in the summer of 37 or the winter of 37. So the later part of the war.
But did the church change
But the
its
church, on the
attitude?
other hand, made a point of supporting Franco. And they did that in part by issuing papal letters, or bishops' letters, not a papal letter, where the bishops all signed a letter saying the forces of godless communism trying to take over Spain, we stand with the king, we stand with Franco. And sadly, that's the way that part of the story went.
Sadly, we need.
I think that's
to
probably
sign it,
not-
unfortunately.
I'll be
so-
glad to sign it.
Thank you.